And we have it. Oh, perfect. Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Shahela Begum. I work with Restore America's Estuaries. I'm the program director for the Long Island Sound Community Impact Fund. And this is a fund that came out of bill funding, which provides financial and technical assistance for organizations, municipalities, tribal groups within the Long Island Sound region. So we created a curriculum and just several training programs, depending on the needs of the region. And so QAPPs were one that organizations wanted to focus on, particularly if they didn't have a QAPP writer on board or they wanted to develop capacity on that end. So we have two sets of trainings. Today, the first one is QAPP 101. Just talking about the basics. And then next Thursday, at the same time, we have another training. And so we've contracted with the Center for Watershed Protection, and they've been doing a great job just supporting organizations in the region, and they will be leading this webinar today. So I'll pass it on to the Center for Watershed Protection, to Lisa.
Great, thank you, Shahela. All right, so on the agenda for today, we're going to do some quick introductions and an icebreaker. And then we're going to dive into QAPP 101. So really what we're going to cover is what is a QAPP, and also when do you know when you need one? So when is it required? We're going to do an overview of all the different elements that go into a QAPP, and then talk about scoping and budgeting to help you, plan out what you need to do or how much time you need to set aside for actually doing the QAPP. And then we have some time for Q&A at the end, but we also have Q&A breaks through each of these sessions. So should be plenty of time to ask questions. So first off, just welcome. Just a little bit of background about the Center for Watershed Protection. We are a national nonprofit. We were founded in 1992, and our mission, excuse me a minute, is to advance clean water resources and healthy ecosystems through responsible land and water management. So we have four main program areas. One is applied research. We also provide watershed and stormwater technical services. We do trainings, and we also have a membership program. And we currently have about 24 staff, and we're headquartered in Maryland, but we also have staff throughout Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, South Carolina, which is where I'm located, and Michigan. And Shahela already gave a nice overview about this webinar series. But with this, our goal really is to help build your capacity to do QAPPs. All right, so we'll go ahead and do some brief introductions for ourselves. Shahela, did you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, I'm the program director for the Long Island Sound Community Impact Fund. We currently have our second round of funding RFA open that's due on November 22nd. So if you have any questions about this or any other future training opportunities you'd like to see, anything that your organization would like to focus on, please feel free to reach out.
And I am Lisa Fraley-McNeil. I am a senior watershed and stormwater research specialist at the Center for Watershed Protection. I do a lot of work with our research projects, also watershed planning. I'm a big GIS nerd. I've been at the center for about 18 years now, and so through that, I've written a lot of QAPPs and also helped other organizations develop their QAPPs. So looking forward to helping folks as much as possible. Deb, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Deb Caraco. I'm a water resources engineer with Center for Watershed Protection, and been there kind of on and off for the last almost 28 years. So I guess I do stormwater and watershed planning work, and I'm kind of like I guess I'm a statistics nerd if Lisa's going to be a GIS nerd, and I've done lots of QAPPs over the years, and more recently I've kind of worked with Lisa on helping people with their QAPPs too. So I hope this is helpful today.
And Chris?
Hi everyone. Chris Swan. I'm a watershed planner with the center. I've been here far longer than I like to admit, but I'm mostly help at this point with writing guidance documents for the center. Also been delving into the world of QAPPs and have written several. Um, and I always find it a challenge to find the good, perfect wording for a QAPP. So, but hopefully we'll be able to impart some of our experiences and knowledge onto you, and that will help you as you're trying to write QAPs for your upcoming projects.
Yep, thanks, Chris. All right, so before we go around and do introductions for everyone, we do have a quick poll question. I'm going to go ahead and launch it here. There you go. You should see it pop up on your screen. But we wanted to get a feel for everybody's experience with QAPs. And so this is asking, how much experience do you have? Have you never written a QAP? Have you contributed to writing sections of a QAP? Maybe you've written a complete QAP and have experience kind of going through the review process. Can you write QAPs in your sleep? Or what is this QAP you are talking about? Everybody, a few more seconds to fill out that poll. Okay, so it looks like most of the folks joining in today have never written a QAP, and there are a couple that have written a QAP and experienced the review process. So that's good. I think we're all, most of us are, going to benefit a lot from this webinar. So hopefully by the end of, today, you'll have a better understanding of QAPs and the process involved and what to look forward to when you need one for your project. Okay, so we're gonna do a quick icebreaker. So we're just gonna go around, and I'll go ahead and call on folks. But when I call on you, if you can just share your name and your organization. If you want to, you can share your experience with QAPs, and also what you hope to gain from today's webinar. So I'm just gonna go down the list. The first person is Eileen.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, excellent. I work with Sound Waters, and we're a marine science education organization in Stamford, Connecticut. We work with a lot of children. And I've never worked on a QAP. I'm very familiar with it. Probably our researcher would provide all the data, but I do a lot of the background budget. I do the forms and the writing. So it's a collaborative position. So I really need guidance. We've never written one, and we have one coming up that we for a salt marsh restoration. So thank you.
Thanks, Eileen. So next up we have Nancy.
Unmute. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
As I was saying, unmute. So I'm Nancy Larson with EPA's National Estuary Program, and I work with Restore America's Estuaries on the NEP Watersheds grants. And so I review QAPs after support from the Center for Watershed Protection, which is wonderful. And so I'm trying to think about templates and how, something could be developed which would facilitate easier QAP development in kind of the restoration and arena. So I'm just kind of listening in and seeing if I get some ideas.
Sounds good. Thanks, Nancy. We'll be talking about templates today, so it'd be good
Awesome.
to pick your brain a little bit.
Great. Well, don't I'm picking yours, so yeah.
Okay. Next up we have Betsy.
Hi, I'm Betsy Graham, and I'm with the Alliance for the Mystic River Watershed, as well as our local lake association, the Lantern Hill Valley Alliance, which is up at the headwaters of the Mystic River Estuary. And I have written one QAPP that was with the EPA Region 1 for their stormwater toolbox kit. And that was an experience. And most of it was already preformed by them. So the experience was trying to add the pertinent details. It took several months. Anyway, so I hope to learn a little bit more about the process officially this way. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Betsy. Next up, we have Christina.
Hi, I'm Christina. I have a few people here with me today. We're with Cornell Cooperative Extension of NAP. We recently put in our wrote our first QAPP and just got our second round of edits back. But yeah, we're working on oyster restoration on the Long Island Sound here, and we're hoping to just gain some more insight so that our next QAPP that we would have to write is a little bit easier, hopefully, than this first one that we've written.
Great, thank you. Next up, we have Michelle.
Hi, all. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I use my phone. Michelle Maitland. I'm a project management specialist for the town of Groton Public Work in Connecticut. Hi, Betsy. Betsy is a kind of a neighbor because the Mystic Alliance for Mystic River Watershed, the Mystic River is in Groton, where I work. And I am an environmental compliance, newbie, but I facilitate the MS4, the municipal separate storm sewer permit for our town. I don't need to write QAPPs, but I oversee contracts with engineers whose projects often involve QAPPs. And after having been involved in enough interview panels where I kind of followed along, but didn't know, I was like, oh, I should probably learn more about this so I can do a better job doing contract administration.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Let me see, who did we miss? Nicole.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nicole Marr. I'm the Senior Coastal Scientist with the Nature Conservancy in New York. I have never written a QAPP before, and what I'm hoping to learn today is which parts of my project need to be covered in a QAPP. I'm sure that pre and post project monitoring needs to be covered, but I'm wondering if there's any other site assessment or any other parts of my project that I need to also include in the QAPP. I'm familiar with the QAPP acronym and lots of things, the reputation that it has, but I've never written one myself. So I'm so excited to be in QAPP 101. Thanks for hosting.
Thanks, Nicole.
Good day.
Sammy.
Hi, I'm Samit Asif Khan. I'm a recent recruitment of Center for Watershed Protection. I work as a water resource engineer here, and I am in the QAPP review team for CWP. I don't know if I have experience in QAPP because I accidentally wrote a document during my grad school, and then my supervisor told me it's actually a QAPP, and it was for a modeling task that we did. So I would say I know how to write a QAPP for modeling task, but not for any other field equipments or any field sampling that we have to do. Thank you.
Yep, thanks, Sammy. All right, did I miss anybody?
We have Christine. Yeah.
Oh, Christine, sorry about that.
Hi. For some reason I came up as Shahela, but I'm not sure. Maybe I clicked on a link that was I don't know, somehow connected to that. But I'm Christine Suter. I'm with Friends of the Bay. We're a marine conservation organization in the Oyster Bay Cold Spring Harbor watershed on Long Island North Shore. I've never written a QAPP personally, but have definitely read and followed them. So yeah, definitely interested in learning all the nuts and bolts behind it.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
I think I forwarded my link just as a reminder to folks. So whoever clicked on that was Shahela. We do have one other person that came in as Shahela whose video is off. If maybe they want to introduce themselves.
Oh.
if that is a phone number, that could be my phone number,
Oh,
which
Okay.
saying.
Okay. That's what it is.
Lisa, I think also Alexandria.
Oh, yes.
Oh, sorry, Alexandria. You know, what
it-
happens is my participant list keeps shifting around and then I lose track of where I am. So sorry.
It's okay. I didn't even realize I didn't introduce myself. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you all today. My name is Alexandria Wilkins, and I work with the Center for Watershed Protection as a watershed planner. I'm a part of the QAPP review team, and I'm going to be on this call today just taking notes and jotting down all your questions so we can incorporate them into the template that we put together.
Great, thank you. All right, so I think now we finally got everybody covered. So it was very nice to meet everyone. It sounds like we have, a wide variety of experience in the group. So I'm happy to have you all today, and hopefully, we'll have time to answer all your questions. All right, so with that, we're going to dive into QAPP 101. So Chris is going to start and cover the basics.
QAPP 101. Do not.
All right. Hi, everyone, again. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to quickly cover some of the basics of what a QAPP is. So, as you know, on our first slide here, we have the EPA definition of what a QAPP is, a planning document related to a project that describes in comprehensive detail the necessary QA/QC requirements and other technical activities that must be implemented to ensure that the results of the work performed will satisfy the stated performance and acceptance criteria. Long and short, I like to think of a QAPP as the how-to manual for the project collection portion of a project. So it's going to tell you who's doing the work, how it's going to be done, how the data is going to be used, where the data might be collected, depending on if you're doing field activities or analyzing existing information. It also covers things like how are you going to, I guess the correct term is confirm the accuracy and usefulness of your data, and just kind of a general description of how the collection process will go along. And Deb and Lisa will go into much more detail on all those elements when they're discussing the different group portions of a QAPP. Okay, next slide, Lisa. So what is a QAPP really? As I said, it's a project-specific QA/QC document. So this is where you're going to spell out exactly what data you're looking at and how you're going to collect it. And the audience for this is not the general public. The audience is usually, in this case, the Restore America's Estuary and the project staff and any contractors that are assisting in the collection of that data. And its goal is to outline the details of how the data is measured, how it's handled, and how you're going to confirm its accuracy, and also how you're going to preserve that data too, because that is a portion of the QAPP process. It also specifically identifies the specific roles of the project participants, whether you're a quality assurance manager, you're the operations manager who's in charge of collecting that data, or you're the field staff that may potentially be out there collecting whatever information you're looking for. It describes how the project team will ensure that data is good enough to meet the needs of the project. This is the portion of a QAPP that I always struggle with, is writing the quality objectives that are associated with this. But it may be the most important part of the QAPP because it is the part that is often reviewed the most, I guess, intensely. And it's also important to note that a QAPP should be a living document that's revised annually. So that once you've written the QAPP once, it doesn't mean it's done and over with. If there are changes in the way a data is being collected, you may have to update the QAPP depending on the extent of those changes. And so it's designed to be updated and then resent to all the participants within the data collection portions of the project. Okay, next slide. So when are QAPPs required? QAPPs are required for all work performed on behalf of the EPA. Basically, whenever you're doing what is termed an environmental information operation. So that's basically a loose term for the collection, production, evaluation, or use of environmental information, or the design, construction, and application of environmental technology. So what's environmental information? That's the data or information that describes the processes or conditions. So that's basically the information that you're collecting, whether it be in the field, in a lab, or through a model. So, and that can consist of what different terminologies for different data. There's primary data, secondary data, or model data. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. It's important to note that the data may also be quantitative or qualitative. And then environmental technology is a term for like the systems and devices that may be used for the collection of that data. Other examples, so it might be measuring or removing pollutants, or measuring and preventing pollutants. So some of the technology kind of things could refer to air scrubbers and emissions, or stormwater BMP practices, stormwater treatment practices as they're now known. And you may be doing monitoring to find out how much removal of a specific pollutant is happening pre and post that practice once it's installed in the ground. So the practice would be considered an environmental technology, and the information that you gather from your pre and post monitoring would be considered environmental information. Next slide, please. As I said, the the different types of data are primary data, which you can basically think of as the new data that you're generating from your project. So, and that can be from field samples, lab analysis, surveys of stakeholders also qualify as primary data. Secondary or data are, it's also sometimes referred to as existing data. That's the data that comes from literature searches, previous projects that you may have done that are relevant to this project, databases you may search, GIS data that you download from a county website or from the National Clearinghouse would also be considered secondary data. And then finally, there's modeling data, and that's when you have an information system or a predictive system that provides a representation of the environment, and you're gathering data and using your data you've collected to plug into there. So an example of that is like a pollutant load calculator, which I believe EPA has one on their website, or even population projections would be considered modeling data. That's estimates from the census of how many people they think may be in a specific area or county. Okay, I think we move on. So now we're going to do a quick game called the Doesn't Need a QAPP game. When I'm looking for information from you, feel free to unmute yourself and give us a yes or no, or you can type it in the chat box, whichever. So the first one is, do you think this needs a QAPP? A study of the effectiveness of aquaculture on nutrient removal by measuring the nitrogen content of kelp shellfish grown adjacent to a wastewater treatment plant. Would that need a QAPP or not?
I'll say yes.
Okay. Right. Okay. Yep. I think we're rolling along, and I'm happy to say everybody got that one right. Yes, that definitely does need a, because you are actually collecting data in the field. So that would need a QAPP. Next one. A community engagement project with data gathered and used for educational purposes only within the immediate community. What's everybody think about that one? All right, this one is a little bit of a tricky one because there's one of the things that defines is how that data is going to be used. So a lot of times if it's only going to be used for educational purposes, not necessarily scientific purposes, it may or may not require a QAPP. A lot. So an example of that would be if you went out and did you were going to be leading a nature walk one day. So you went out the day before and counted how many types of birds are in an area. That may or may not need a QAPP because you're not collecting that under a specific survey protocol. So you're just using it as educational information for the nature walk and saying, these types of species are present in our area, but that data is not going to be used for any kind of an analysis. Next, a riparian habitat restoration project that involves vegetation surveys and community engagement. Does everybody think about that one? The answer to that one is yes, specifically because of the vegetation surveys, and the community engagement portion could, if you're using public volunteers to gather and help you do those vegetation surveys, then that needs to be accounted for as well in your QAPP. And then finally, number 4, a review of existing monitoring data to calibrate a model for development of a watershed plan. All right. So the answer to this one is, this is another tricky one. The answer to this one, it's actually based on a QAPP that's quite old. And the answer is maybe. Specifically for this example, they were doing a 2-part project. So they had part 1 was gathering data together and calibrating an existing model. And they specifically wrote a project plan just for that one. And then in part 2, they were going to use that model to analyze a particular watershed and help create a watershed management plan. So in this case, for part 1, they actually were not required to do a QAPP because it was considered, they were only calibrating a model. But for part 2, they did need to write a QAPP when they actually used the calibrated model to do their analysis of the data gathered. So thanks everybody for those. I'm not going to give you any more project examples and more any more tests. The important thing to know about this is a good place to consult with your project officer on that, because they should be able to answer to you whether or not a QAPP would be required for that. So a lot of times when they review that project plan, they can tell you whether or not you're going to be required to do a QAPP. But in general, a QAPP is needed if your project's being funded by the EPA or you're getting federal funds and it collects or uses environmental data. The other time that you might want a QAP is if you want others to consider using your data in the future. So if you want that data to be available to others and be able to be used in future scientific studies, then it's good. It might be good to have a QAP, especially if it's going to be used for management level or science-based decision making by an organization. And I think with that, I'll open it up if anybody has any questions. Myself or the other staff will be happy to try and answer. Okay.
Hold on. We have a question. Is a QAP only needed for an EPA funded project, or is it any federal funded project?
I can specifically tell you for EPA, it's yes. I'm not sure, Deb, Lisa, you have any input on whether or not QAPs are required if you're getting funding from other agencies? I would imagine NOAA might require one. If it is basically almost if it's science-based, I think it will probably need a QAP.
Okay, thank you.
I think NIFWF does as well.
Yeah, that's true. NIFWF definitely requires, but part of that's because NIFWF receives their funding from federal sources, so
Yeah, that's true.
QAP is usually required for them. So, so if that basically comes down to federal funding, we'll often require that QAP. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
I have a question. If so you were saying you would need one if other groups were going to potentially use your data. What if you have a project and I guess it's not being funded by the EPA or the DEC or federal funding? Who would you then be able to get anybody to review your QAP?
Not likely.
Yeah, that's what I
So I only put that in there because that was a tip from somebody else that like you know, say in the future you've gone out and you had a project but it wasn't funded using federal funds, and you've gathered data and somebody in the future wants to use that data for their project. If you have a QAP, it helps support and validate that data so that it would be accepted into a data set for analysis. If without the QAP, there's good possibility that it wouldn't be accepted, or it might not meet the criteria to be considered valid secondary data. So.
Okay, yeah, I was just thinking about like a water quality monitoring program that's not federally funded, but just being considered valid data without having that entity review it. So
yeah, I can tell you that I went through and wrote a QAP for a project, and then realized afterwards that a QAP wasn't required because it was not funded with federal funds. It was funded with state funds. So we didn't really need a QAP, but it had been written into the project plan. So we still had to write it just because it was already listed as a required task. So,
okay.
Nicole, you had your hand raised?
Oh, just before.
Oh,
Okay.
hold on.
Did someone need to follow up on Christine's question?
Oh, I was just gonna mention we did have a case where we did not have a federally funded project, but through the grant program, they still wanted a QAP. And so it kind of went through this review process where they had an advisory team that was more like unofficial, but it was kind of a different process. So
Okay.
depending on your funding organization, they may or may not require or want something like that.
Thanks.
So I've got a question about part of my project that I think falls in the maybe category. And maybe this is something I should take up with my project officer directly. But part of my project includes a site assessment of a wetland to identify hydrological impairments, where water is being stopped on the marsh, to use that information to design a simple hydrological restoration designs. Does that sound like it's sort of gathering information, sort of reading a site, figuring out where water is being impounded or overdrained, and figuring out that using that information to design restoration plans? Does that sound like something? Have I given you enough information to say that sounds like something that requires QAPP?
Deb, go ahead. I'll let you.
Sorry. Oh, no. I guess if you asked me 5 years ago, I would have said probably not. But today I would say probably, yeah, because it's kind of meeting that criteria that, you're collecting this data and has to be of a quality to make a decision to do something. So, and this is, at least I don't know, at least, and Chris, I don't know if you'll agree with this. This is kind of different than it used to be, I feel like. But yeah, today I would say probably, yeah, yes. What do you think,
I
Lisa?
agree, Deb. I think
Yeah.
that because it's a site assessment and it's being used for kind of like prioritization and design work, then it would probably require a QAPP. So.
Yep.
Thank you.
And I see Betsy asked in the chat, is it beneficial to do one anyway? Again, I think that depends on how much, whether you want your data, if you're not required to do one, whether or not you want that data to be considered for future use. But also accounting for the fact that it does take time to write a QAPP, and when it's done, you won't necessarily be able to find somebody who can review that QAPP for you if it's not a required by your project officer. So I would say that if your goal is to help contribute to data collection, then it might not be a bad idea to work up a QAPP, and maybe you might not need it to the detail of some of the templates that come out, but just explanations of what you're collecting, how you've done it, and how you're maintaining that data and how you've checked that data to confirm its accuracy would be beneficial to have. But it does take time to write a QAPP, and if you have, and it takes significantly more time than you usually think to write the QAPP as well, I will say. So. All right, well, I think if I don't see any more questions, I will turn it over to Lisa and Deb to walk through the required elements of a QAPP.
Great, thanks, Chris. Okay, so the required elements of a QAPP are outlined in EPA's QAPP standard. And so this is a new standard that came out, and it applies to all projects or all grants that were funded after August of 2023. So if you've written a QAPP in the past or have experience with QAPPs, you've likely used the old R5 document that also outlined elements that are required in a QAPP. But this new standard does have some differences from the old standard. The main things being that there's some differences in terminology, some reordering of the sections. The new standard really specifies content as opposed to format. So while they have all these sections and ordering in there, you can still put them in different orders, depending on what fits best for your project or how you'd like to lay it out. But you do have to have every section of the QAPP that they require in there. And so even if there may be a section in the QAPP that doesn't specifically apply to your project, you still have to have that in your QAPP with a note saying why it doesn't apply. The new standard also calls for annual reviews for projects longer than 1 year. So like Chris said, the QAPP is a living document. It's supposed to be revised, but it's also supposed to be reviewed every year just to make sure you're not deviating from the QAPP. And if you are deviating, by any substantial amount, you may need to do a revision. So with this new QAPP standard, it comes out of EPA headquarters, but it gets implemented through the EPA regions. And so the different regions are kind of working on, how they're rolling out this standard. in their areas. And so there's a little bit of variability between different regions. And so specifically for like the Long Island Sound region, Region 1 has developed a template and a guidance that follows the new standard. So I think this is really helpful if you go onto their website. They have like a Word document template you can download, so that kind of helps you get a start with the QAPP. And then they also have a guidance document that kind of walks you through the information that should go in each section. Region 2 refers to the new standard to use, but doesn't have a specific template or any other own specific guidance documents developed yet. And if you look at some of the other regions, they're kind of all in this same situation. I think Region 4 down in Florida was looking to develop their own templates and things, but they're kind of still in the process. And so depending where your project is, it's always good to check with your specific EPA region just to see what documents they have, if they have any specific requirements, and if they have a specific template that they'd like you to use. And so like I mentioned, there's some new terminology. A lot of the information is the same between the old and the new QAPP standard, but they just refer to things a little bit differently. Chris talked about environmental information. So this is basically environmental data. This is all the data and information that describes environmental processes or conditions. And there's the environmental information operations. So really what this is the data collection activities. So this is, going out and collecting samples, producing, evaluating environmental information. And it also applies to that environmental technology that Chris mentioned. So like if you have a stormwater practice, environmental information operations may apply to that as well. And one of the other new terms that came out was the operation manager. You have to specifically in your QAPP note who's going to be the operations manager. And this is the person that is responsible for environmental tasks. And it's often the project manager or the program manager. And so I'm not sure if you've all seen this before, but this Plan, Do, Check, Act model is like a continuous problem solving model. And it kind of aligns nicely with the sections of the QAPP. So when you're in the plan section, this is group A of the QAPP elements. And so this is the very beginning section of your QAPP. And this deals with your project management and information and your data quality objectives. And so this is the section where it describes the overall plan for the project, kind of gives some background, outlines what the tasks are, basically what you're hoping to achieve with your project. And then when you get to the do section of the model, you're into group B. And so this is implementing your environmental information operations. And so this is how the plan will be implemented. So this will outline like your sampling strategy if you're collecting samples, how you actually collect those samples, how you're going to check the quality of that information as you go along, how you're going to document it and record information. The check section is group C, so that's the assessment and oversight. And this group C applies for, assessing how the project will be assessed and at what frequency. So this is as you're collecting the data for your project, how are you ensuring that you're collecting it appropriately? Are you going out and doing field audits, checking your data as it comes in, things like that. And then the ACT section is group D, and this deals with environmental information review and usability determination. And so this section occurs after you've collected all your data. Now, how do you determine whether that information is usable for your project? Did it meet your data quality objectives? Are there any limiting factors you came across? And so it documents, how usable it is relating back to the goals of your project. So we're going to spend a little bit of time walking through a little bit more through each of these group elements, and I'm going to hand it over to Deb to talk through group A and B.
Okay, great, thanks. So yeah, just starting out with group A is the plan part, and this is where you just kind of outline what, like Lisa said, what you're gonna do in the project. So one kind of caveat to these, we're presenting these just straight in the order of the EPA documentation, and we've kind of referred you over to Region 1, which kind of rejiggers the order around a little bit. So that's just like an uphead. Just trying to group the elements. There's 11 elements under Part A. And this is kind of, again, where you're just kind of doing the basic planning out of your project. The first 3 elements of the QAPP are really basically administrative elements like document control. They just have, there's a title of page, there's a page that everybody signs, and your table of contents. At our next training, we're going to talk through a template we're putting together to help, and that should be, pretty self-evident, what kind of things go in that section, but it also has to be pretty particular. Okay, A4 through A6 is where you scope out the project and you describe, this is where you say, how good does my data have to be? Like, what's my objectives for my data? Sections A4 and A5, when people make a mistake on this section, I think the biggest mistake they make is that they go into too much detail. They start talking about like what kind of lab methods they're going to use. It as a guideline, I guess I would say what information you used to write your grant is usually pretty good for section 4. You're saying, why was I doing this? Sections 4 and 5. Why was I doing the project? What are my key things I'm trying to find out, if it's hypotheses, or what am I trying to do? And section 5 would be basically like a bulleted list and description of what your tasks are. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here about the data quality objectives. I think this is one of the most difficult parts of a QAPP for people to write and kind of not get sucked down a black hole a little bit. So I'll talk about it a little bit more. Okay, so there's 2 things here. There's data quality objectives and data quality indicators. So the data quality objectives are basically you're asking the question, how good does my data have to be? So for a scientific study, if you had, a hypothesis, which is, I think, nitrogen concentrations are higher in Creek A than Creek B. You would say, you should have a statement that says, we want to collect enough samples and at a good enough quality that we're going to be able to detect a 20% concentration difference. You don't have to document exactly how you did that here, but like that's kind of a statement that you're making. Sometimes it's not quantitative like that, though. Sometimes you're just going to say, we want to determine if sites are toxic. So we're going to use the best available techniques, and that's the standard we're using. But you need some, way to say, this is how good it needs to be. For data, so for primary data, this is another place people get really caught up. For primary data, there's a system that the EPA uses called PARCS, which is that data has to be precise, accurate, representative. There's comparability, completeness, and sensitivity. And so, what each of these elements are, what you need to identify in data quality information is, what is your measure going to be? You have to say how you're going to measure precision and how precise it has to be. So, for example, precision says how repeatable is it? So, if you're collecting data in the field, collecting 2 samples at once, that would show it's repeatable. I got the same answer twice. So your indicator might be, the duplicate samples are only 20% different, within 10% of one another. That would be, you have to indicate that here. Accuracy is, I did a a blank, or I did a known concentration, a standard, how much and your measure indicator would be, how close am I to that standard? Representativeness is, am I representing either a whole population or am I representing the site? Your indicator would be, I've covered, I have a sample for every season. I have, collected a grid that covers, a representative areas of the site. So that would be your indicator of whether you did it. Comparability is more kind of it's not as numeric, and it's basically if you want to combine two data sets, am I producing data that I could then combine with another data set, or is my detection limit 10 times higher and it's just a bunch of zeros? Completeness is, did I collect everything I wanted to? So you're saying up front, I'm planning on collecting 1,000 samples or whatever, 100 samples. My indicator is that for my data to be usable, I have to, collect at least, 90% of the samples I intend to. Things go wrong, there's whatever bad weather, things get contaminated, but you say like my indicator is I'm going to have to collect at least 90% of those. And sensitivity, some people actually think of precision as being sensitivity. Sensitivity is like for a lab process, it would be like, what's my limit of detection? How small of an increment can I tell the difference of about it? And, so you would kind of set out, what you need for this. One kind of square peg in a round hole thing people sometimes do is they try to apply this system to other data. I'm not going to talk about it too much here, but if you're doing like secondary data or modeling data, there's other kind of more like general assessments that you can do as long as you're just, again, saying out front, this is how good it has to be. The next parts of the QAPP, A7 through A12, are really all about like people and communication. They're kind of identifying what are people doing? How am I communicating like within the project team? What kind of reports do I need to do? So just kind of a quick, bullet list. The distribution list, which is who's going to get a copy of the QAPP and who will get the updates. The project organization really outlines, this person or this organization is responsible for this task. So this is really just like your work writing out a detailed, part of the details of the project scope, just identifying who's going to be doing what. One thing that can be a little bit tricky, and I'll talk about the next one, is this quality assurance manager independence. So there's supposed to be a person who is independent of the work that's responsible for quality assurance. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the next one. Organizational chart. I'm going to talk, this is starred because I'm going to, one more slide where I talk a little bit more about it, but just a nice org chart, and there's a little bit of details about how that should be. And then the last one, if people need special training. So this can be that you're going to actually provide training as part of your project, or it could be that you say like the person doing this job is certified as a wetland scientist, pretend, or they're a professional engineer or a geologist or whatever it is. But it's like whatever experience or the lab or whoever they need to do that, you're going to make sure that they have that. Finally, documents and records. This is not about the management of environmental data. It's more like every month or every quarter, we're doing a report to EPA that we're going to, send that over to them. It's how you're going to manage documents and how you're going to report within the project. This is an example org chart. This is from the EPA Region 1 guidance. You'll see here the project manager, which is like the project officer. So the mistakes that people often make on the org chart is they're a little bit too deep into their own organization and not inclusive of others outside of it. So if somebody's not on the project, like you don't need to include people who work in your organization but aren't involved in the project. But you do need to include, like, how's the EPA project officer going to be involved? Shahila should be on your org chart, for example, in this project. One thing that's kind of challenging, I know many of you are fairly small organizations. Sometimes it's difficult to have enough people so that you have a QA person that's not doing anything on the project, and then you also have, all these other people that are working on the project. Ideally, you would have this QA person that's, just independent. They're coming in and, doing the job of looking at everything. But sometimes this can be something to talk through with the EPA, because again, you may just run out of people. But again, you're just identifying how people connect with one another, how they're communicating. And we're gonna do A and B questions together. Group B is about doing. Part of it's kind of plan do, but this is where we're saying, all right, we've kind of outlined like who the people are, what we're trying to do. And this is kind of more like how and why are we trying? How are we going to do it in detail? Like really get to the nuts and bolts. Okay, so B1 and B2 is basically talking about like the detailed tasks and the methods for how you're going to do this work. Sometimes people get tripped up a little bit because section A5 says, here's the tasks of my project. And then section B1, it feels like people aren't sure exactly what to do there. This is much more detail about kind of how and why you're going to do the project. So for example, if you're developing a sampling plan, in section A5, you might say, we're going to collect samples. In section B1, you're going to say, we're collecting, 5 samples each quarter at these specific sites. If you have a way to justify the number of samples, you would talk about that there. It's a kind of more detailed, again, like your experimental design, if you're doing something that's asking a question, your monitoring plan, like all those details, that would be in section B1. Section B2 is more about how you're going to either collect or analyze that data. So if this is a primary data, this would have things like the lab is using EPA method, blah, blah, blah. We are, we have standard operating procedures for how we collect data. The lab has its standard operating procedures. Referencing those methods or bulleting them out. Like this is going to include that detail, wash the bottle 3 times or, core the sample X deep. So, and if you're doing something that's like modeling or analysis, this will have like, the equations you're gonna, be using. So this is really about the nuts and bolts of how you're analyzing. B3 and B4 is, so you've kind of said, I have a sampling plan, or I have, a list of items I'm going to do. And I told you like the detail how we're going to do it. B3 and B4 is, so what are you doing during the project to make sure that you're providing quality control? So 2 of those things that are kind of on that topic. One is the integrity of environmental information. So this is really about making sure that your data that the data you collect or the information, especially the samples, can be retained. So if you're collecting data, or any kind of information, like if you have any kind of like chain of custody kind of forms, or policies for how you pass data from one person to another, that would be in this section. And B4 is about the quality control activities. This is, again, I think a place where people, it kind of is like refers back to another section. Section A, Sec 6, we talked about like, oh, we have to have 20% of field blanks or the data are within 20% of what a field blank is. That should kind of be, those data quality indicators should be reflected in this section. Where here you'd say, we're going to do field blanks at 10% of our samples, or we're going to, do these specific activities to make sure our data is good enough. Even if you're not collecting data, some of that'll be like, we'll have somebody check spreadsheets to make sure that, the data were entered properly, or, we'll have another person review that data at X interval. So it's like, how are you checking as you go along and make sure that the data is meeting its standard? And the last 5 through 7 is all about equipment and environmental information management. So part of this is, are you inspecting? How are you inspecting and calibrating and testing and maintaining your equipment? Often, you think of this as kind of like lab related stuff. If you have a spectrophotometer, how often do you calibrate it? There should often be kind of like SOPs for stuff like that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what is equipment. We're going to have a little quiz. This is something people are often really tripped up on. Inspection and acceptance of supplies and services. So again, if you think of it like a lab, it would be like, is it past its expiration date? Is this, is it open? Like we have a process for accepting that kind of supplies. But similarly, if you have a subcontractor and they're doing services, how would you determine that to make sure that their services are good enough? Now, this could reflect back, they're a certified lab, or, we ask them to be checked by another person, so it's basically like, what are your criteria for accepting information or services or, supplies you're going to use? Finally, environmental information management. This is basically like, how's the data going to be kept? Where is it going to be stored? How long? Are there backups? If your organization has a data management policy, that can be like a first step toward getting you there in this system, in this section. But it's kind of just that, like, making sure that the information is stored and managed properly so you're not losing information. Okay. So we have a quiz. Is this a quiz we are launching? No, okay, sorry. Sorry. So one trouble people really have in QAPPs is they don't know if they have equipment or not. So do you think a printer should be listed as equipment on your QAPP? If you could say yes or no.
No.
Yeah, I'm with you on this. So you don't need to say, I'm going to change the toner X time because I'm using this printer. You don't need to do that. And I don't think people do that very often anymore. Anyway, camera. So using a camera as part of field. So we've got a couple yeses. Yep. No, besides cell phones. So the answer to this one's yes. We had a project where people were documenting whales, and they thought, well, I don't have to, this is just cameras. It's not really equipment, but it is, you know, you have to kind of say like, we're using a Canon SLR or equivalent. So the answer is yes, if, you know, unless you're just using it for fun pictures. How about your computer? Oh, Nicole had a question.
Yeah, so my question is the differentiating between supplies and equipment and a budget is based on dollar value and intent. So, but this is different. You're looking for
does it need to be
quality.
Right? Does it need to be? Do you need to talk about in the QAPP like I used this kind of whatever it is, I maintained it, I had to calibrate it, I had to do whatever with it. Computer, no, you're right. So even if you're doing modeling, you don't have to say, if my computer breaks, I'm going to take it to my tech support person and deal with that. Everybody does that every day. So no, you don't need it for that. Thermometer. Yeah. So even really simple, like if it's a thermometer or like simple pH meter, you have to describe, you know, how you're going to maintain them, how you're going to check them to make sure they're not somehow drifting. You know, even if it's an almost perfectly reliable thing, you should, you do need to describe just kind of how you're dealing with them. Okay. There's a little time for a Q&A. Any questions on those sections?
Deb, there was one question in the
sorry,
chat earlier about like distinguishing between the operations manager and like the project manager. Like
okay.
and I think you addressed it a little bit, like when you have
Yeah, I think I used the wrong
limited
term when I
staff,
talk about it. Yeah, yeah. So the operations manager and the project manager is the same, can be the same person. That's the same person. The issue is the QA manager, that ideally you want somebody who's like a unbiased judge that just, you know, they don't have any stake in what's there. I guess they're not caught up in the day-to-day of collecting data and doing the project and all of this. When you're in a small organization, this is something to really, really talk. These roles get really complicated, and it's really worth kind of talking through with your project officer at EPA. Because again, some of the organizations, you know, you're a handful of staff. So I think sorry, I didn't see what the question was. Yeah, the QA manager is supposed to be a different, I'm sorry, I'm seeing the question now. So ideally, the QA manager should be from your organization, but not the project manager. But again, this is something to talk through with EPA if you're kind of running out of people. The idea is it's a person like, so at Center for Watershed Protection, we do projects and we have somebody whose role is the Q, and they're, you know, they may be on the project, but they're not doing all the day to day. Their job is basically like, you know, if you run into trouble, you ask them for questions, you ask them for some kind of like general guidance. But again, many organizations run into trouble with this where they don't have enough people, and there might be overlap. Maybe that somebody is, you know, maybe they're on the monitoring team, but they're also doing the QA. So trying to work that out can be, it's just something to work out ahead of time. I guess it's not necessarily a problem, it's something to work out ahead of time.
Nicole, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'd love to circle back to the camera. So did you determine, I may have been thinking and distracted, that a camera is a piece of equipment that
Yeah.
needs to be described. So
Yeah.
then what about photo posts. If we are going to establish fixed photo stations in the field where we intend citizen scientists or community members or even project staff to use their cell phone positioned at the top of a fixed photo post to document changes in the field?
Oh, that's a good question. So this is people using their own cell phones.
Largely, yes.
Yeah. What do you guys think? This is it's not this is an art and a science, I guess. What do you guys think, Lisa and Chris?
It may be enough, like in the QAPP, to say that everybody's gonna use their own cell phone, but set up certain like minimum specs, like it has a minimum of X number of megapixels or something like that.
I guess also, yeah, so what, I guess part of the question too is like, what's the intent of the data? Like if it's in the one project we're describing, like they were trying to identify like what species of whale is this and are they hurt and like a lot of details. So they needed like a really good camera. And so, and it had to be working right. And they didn't want to miss a shot because like whatever, you'd only see a humpback only so often. And, but maybe the use of that data that you have might be less intense. So maybe it's enough to say that if you say it's kind of like you like so it's not maybe not equipment you have to maintain, but you should, talk about how you're going to use it. And I think when you lay out your data quality objectives, that can help frame that, say like we just need a photo that, is general information or is for, doesn't need a lot of detail. You can probably talk about this a little bit differently. But yeah, that's a great question.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's always moving. Yeah.
Okay, so just a quick time check. We have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure we have enough time to get through like the scoping and budgeting sections. I think that's going to be, something that you all are interested in and may have questions about. So I'm briefly going to gloss through sections C and D, and then we'll talk about scoping and budgeting. So section C is really dealing with the assessment and oversight. And section C, when you look at it with section D, it kind of looks similar. And so a lot of people get confused about what goes in section C versus what goes in section D. I think the key distinction is section C is like the assessment of your data as you're collecting it or as you're using it during the project. Section D kind of gets to the data review and the usability of it after you've collected all your data. Now you're analyzing it and kind of relating it back to your project objectives. Like, can you use this data to meet what you set out to do? So section C1 deals with assessments and response actions. So this describes how a project's activities are going to be assessed during the project and ensures that the QAPP is being implemented as approved. And so this can be things like doing your field or laboratory audits, inspections, performance evaluations. And then it also, you need to describe in this section, like what are your response actions? Like if you find that something's wrong, how are you going to correct it or how are you going to respond to it? Then section C2 deals with kind of your reports about that assessment. And so this is the oversight procedures and documents about how the project management and other stakeholders are kept informed. So you've done all these you've done this assessment, and now how are you going to let people know? How are you going to document the QA/QC you did? How are you going to let your project managers know or the project team, your grants officer? If you're doing any reports for your grant, this is where you might put that in this section as well. And then moving on to section D, which is the environmental information review and usability determination. So this section addresses the activities associated with environmental information review for the purpose of determining whether the information meets the data quality objectives that you'll outline in Section A, and the performance and acceptance criteria that Deb talked about. Section D1 is environmental information review. So it's reviewing the procedures for determining whether the data and information meets the stated data quality objectives. And then Section D2 is the usability determination. So with this, it's like you've gathered all your data and you're looking at it. How do you know that you've collected the right type or the right amount of data to support like your intended use of it? In this section, you would explore things like, what are your data outliers? You know, was there anything that any of the results you found that didn't align with what you expected to find, and why, and how you're going to use the data if you find that your results aren't what you thought they were going to be. Okay, I'm going to skip the Q&A for section C and D and hold it off to the end just because I want to make sure we get through the scoping and budgeting. And so when you're going about to do a QAPP, so you have a project, you need a QAPP, it's important to know, you know, where in the timeline this, how this works within your project timeline. And so this timeline here we generated with the purpose of the LISCIF grants in mind, or grantees, but I think this could apply to just about anyone, just with some few tweaks. But basically, you're going to start out, you've written a project proposal, you've gotten grant funding, and now you need to develop a QAPP. So your next step is to go about developing the QAPP. And so for like the LISCIF grantees, this is where the Center for Watershed Protection can be available in the beginning before you actually develop a QAPP. So if you have questions or haven't written a QAPP before, or just need some general guidance to kind of talk through, you know, what you're doing with your project and how you should approach a QAPP, we're available to help get that started. Then the third step here, after you've developed your QAPP, this is where the Center for Watershed Protection does a review of the QAPP. So we have about a 2-week turnaround time for our reviews. Our goal with doing this is to help you get through the EPA review process quicker. So we're kind of reviewing these QAPPs as if, you know, thinking like we are an EPA reviewer and what EPA would flag, you know, as questions or comments they have, anything that might be red flags, things you might want to consider revising. And we'll provide those comments to you or the grantees, and then the QAPP would then need to be revised and then submitted to EPA for review. So hopefully by the time it's submitted to EPA for review, you have a pretty good QAPP that's not going to require too much time for review or require a lot of edits after EPA does the review. When it goes to EPA review, they can take up to 60 days generally, but I think like in regions 1 and 2, and Shahela, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, I think they tend to be a little bit faster. They're usually around 30 days or less. So you'll get comments back from EPA, and then you have to revise the QAPP. And then once you revise it, you have to resubmit it to EPA, and then it has to go through the review process again. I think once you get to this second round of review, it goes a little bit quicker. And those reviews generally take about up to 30 days. And then you would make those final revisions, have your final QAPP. You would send it into EPA for hopefully the final time, and then EPA gives you the approval. And so once you get the approval, you get everybody's signatures on the QAPP then gets finalized. And at this point, once you have a final approved QAPP is when you can start working on the project. A lot of people ask, you know, this can be a daunting process, right? Because now you've added maybe 1, 2, 3 months potentially, maybe more, depending on how complex your project is. You know, can we get started on any parts of the project before we have this QAPP developed? And the answer is yes. You can start on some things, but you cannot start on anything that requires data collection or use of the data that you're collecting or any type of data analysis. What you can start on is potentially gathering data. So maybe you're doing like a literature review and you're using secondary data, you can start actually gathering those data sources. You can pull together your project team. You can do some basic like organization type things. But you really need to make sure you're not doing any of like the actual data collection for primary data or data analysis or modeling before you have the approved QAPP. A lot of common questions that are asked are who are the key staff? I think Deb covered this pretty well. But you'll want to include like your senior manager, operations manager, project QA manager, and basically anybody that is involved with the data collection. This could be like your laboratories, consultants. These should all be included in the QAPP and they should all receive copies of the QAPP. Another thing people run into is maybe they have the grant, but they have consultants that are doing a lot of the work. And so because they have the grant, they have to write the QAPP, but then they need to get information from the consultants to write the QAPP. And so just know, you may need to be reaching out to like your labs or any contractors you have and have them help you with the specific methods or SOPs that they're using. And then what happens if I don't know the exact methods that I'll be using? And this is actually pretty common. And I think, EPA likes to see QAPPs that are, completely done, have all the methods finalized as much as possible. But there may be some instances where you just don't know what the method is. Or maybe the method is going to depend on which contractor you hire, but you haven't hired a contractor yet. And so when you run into this situation, you kind of have to make a little bit of a judgment call. You may want to, I'd suggest talking to your EPA project officer kind of about the best approach and the situation with your specific project, because it could be that they may allow you to submit a QAPP that has a section where you note that, the methodology for this specific thing we're doing is to be determined. But they may also ask you if you do submit it with that section that's kind of like not finalized yet, you may be asked to revise a QAPP in the revise the QAPP in the future after you hire your contractor and get the method finalized. So it's just kind of a juggle in terms of like your specific project and the timeline of when you're wanting to start the project versus getting all the methodology and the contractors and everything on board. And then lastly, just budgeting for QAPPs. And this is a tough one because all projects are different. Some of the considerations for the amount of staff time you'll need when drafting a QAPP is one, how complex is your project? Is it a simple project that has standard methods and SOPs that you can refer to, or is this maybe you're doing something that has a completely new method? So that might be a more complex project. You'll have to take into consideration coordinating with all the members of the project team to get the information that you need for the QAPP. And sometimes this can take some time to, really pull out the information you need, because you might need to go back and forth with a lab to get the specific QAPP information, or go back and forth with a consultant. And, are you following existing methods or using a new method? So like I stated earlier, a more simple QAPP, you may be following existing SOPs that you can refer to. It takes a little bit less time than drafting up like a new methodology or approach that you're using. And while I kind of hesitate to give you specific estimates on staff time because these are really variable, but here's just some general guidelines. If you're doing a very simple QAPP, maybe 24 to 30 hours. This may be a type of project you've done before. Maybe you have a QAPP for a previous project you can kind of use as a model. That would kind of fall into the simple QAPP category. Average QAPPs, maybe 40 to 50 hours. And then if you have something really complex, this is not to scare you, but it can possibly take up to 100 or over 100 hours. A QAPP like that would be something where you don't have specific SOPs already. Maybe you're doing a variety of different are using a variety of different data. So you might be doing primary data collection, maybe you're doing secondary data with a literature review, and maybe you're also doing a model. And maybe you also have a very large project team and a lot of different methods that are involved. And so that would be a complex QAPP. And then some tips for more efficient QAPPs. So we are developing a template that can be used for the LISCIF grantees. I know I said Region 1 earlier has a template. And so we are also developing a template that is specific for the LISCIF program. And this template will include some additional explanation of what goes in each section. We're also going to be including examples of different types of projects in there. And it'll also include some kind of standard language that you can work with, because I think a lot of the problem with QAPPs is if you don't have something written already, it's kind of hard to come up with that language yourself. And so we'll kind of give you some template language that you can take and use and kind of tweak a little bit for your specific needs. Another tip for an efficient QAPP is refer to any existing SOPs and don't reinvent the wheel. So you don't have to, you can just refer to an existing SOP in the QAPP, but you don't have to rewrite all those methods in each section. You can just kind of put the SOP in appendix and refer to that, and then you're usually pretty good. Also, feel free to use Center for Watershed Protection Assistance. That's what we're here for. We can help. Like I said, before you even start the QAPP, we can help kind of set you on the right path and give you some guidelines. And then also, like Deb mentioned earlier, just keep in mind that, a lot of people kind of put together a really quick QAPP and don't include all the details, but there's a lot of informal or more simple project actions that do need to be described in the QAPP. So kind of going back to the camera example. So just keeping in mind that you are going to have to describe in detail some things that you may have not been expecting to. So I'm very sorry, that was a very, very quick run through of the scope and also sections C and D. We are right at 11:30, but we can stick around if anybody has questions. Happy to stay on board for a while.
I have a question. I don't know, maybe this is a silly question, but when we were talking about potentially running out of people, like for QA, QC, are volunteers ever, if you have a consistent volunteer, ever allowed to be part of any of this, or does it have to be somebody that's on your payroll?
No, you can definitely include volunteers in your QAPP to help with data collection, but you will need to outline probably in the training section, specifically how you're going to train those volunteers and kind of outline guidelines for the quality control of the data that they collect.
Right.
Deb and Chris, anything to add that we didn't cover?
Just real quickly, there is a possibility, I saw this in a QAPP where one organization had two different quality assurance and operations managers, even though they were in the same organization and it was the same people, they just flipped roles because the operations manager for the field collection was then QA QC'd by the lab manager. Then the lab manager's portion was QA QC'd by the field operations person. So that's one way to help account for a smaller staff as well. That is allowable with EPA approval.
Yeah. No, that's a good point, Chris. Yeah.
Shahela, did you have any final words?
No, you guys did a fantastic job. Thank you so much for shedding all this information and just I think this will be a great supporting document and just recording for other folks. And I did want to mention that we're going to continue the QAPP discussions for next Thursday at 10 a.m. if you wanted to register for that. And we'll be taking a deeper dive into specific examples and guidance along those lines. But thank you so much for the Center for Watershed Protection team.
Great.
Thank you,
Shahela.
everyone. Thank you, Shahila. And can you say if those of us who've got conflicts with next Thursday but want to benefit from that webinar next week, will that recording be made available as well? Super.
Yeah,
Thanks.
so most of all of our training webinars are always uploaded later with the slides and information. Yeah, so it'll be available on that website. And if you sign up for updates, we usually send like a newsletter out indicating like when we've updated it. And so people can stay tuned for future trainings too.
And Chris, I believe we had a couple of like follow-up survey questions that get launched at the end of the Zoom poll. Are those
Yes,
set up?
as it'll pop up as soon as you sign out. It'll pop up with a quick survey through your browser. So yeah.
Yeah, if you have a couple minutes and don't mind filling that out, it's just asking, kind of topics of interest that you'd still like to see or questions you have. So that would help guide, any future trainings. And it also may guide some of the information we include in the webinar next week.
Thank you so much.
Yep, thanks, everyone.